Welcome to Trends with Benefits, an award-winning podcast by Van Eck with a forward-looking perspective. We explore new ways of thinking about the markets, work, and life. Here's your host, Ed Lopez.
Welcome to another episode of Trends with Benefits. In today's special episode, we'll be speaking with Laurie Wayburn of Pacific Forest Trust and Anthony Gibbs, Creative Director at Imaginary Forces. And we're going to be talking about their new documentary, Beyond the Trees. It's a documentary about the Van Eck Forest, which have employed an innovative model for sustaining working forests. Now, what that means is instead of managing solely for output of timber and fiber and for development value, Pacific Forest Trust manages the whole forest. And we'll talk to Laurie about that. Laurie's co-founder and president of Pacific Forest Trust. And we'll be talking about the model that they've employed in the Van Eck Forest for, I don't know, how long now, Laurie? How long has that model been?
20 years.
So with that, Laurie, Anthony, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And Laurie, this is your second time on. I appreciate you coming back.
Always a pleasure. I hope I'll get another chance at another time.
The last time we spoke a lot about what Pacific Forest Trust does and the reasoning behind it and everything that goes into it. And I'll invite our listeners to go and listen to that podcast. We'll perhaps touch on some of those elements here, but I really wanted to talk about the documentary, which I think is a really interesting project. I think it's a fantastic documentary about the Van Eck forests and what Pacific Forest Trust is doing there. And, maybe really the place to start here is, why do the documentary? What was the motivation to do the documentary, Laurie?
The documentary really grew from an idea that Jan Van Eck had, because he was looking at the legacy of the family and, frankly, how this model of forestry really was a very creative and positive disruption of the forest industry. Forest industry has been pretty staid. It has relied on timber and fiber, as you say, and development values to drive its economic returns. But in working with the Van Eck forests and the vision of Fred Van Eck, Jan saw that this was a completely new way to take on the management of forests for all of their values, because in looking at the world, he and his family can see the impact of climate change. Having their kids out there, they could see that, forests are really multi-generational. And when you look at the challenges that these next generations have in a world that is so impacted by climate change, Jan's idea was, let's tell this story, because this could be replicated at a large scale and have an enormously positive impact. And he said, let's do a film. So to tell that story, and that's when I got to meet Anthony and go, okay, now that's what storytelling is.
How did that come about? How did you get to meet Anthony during this process?
We, which is to say Van Eck and the Pacific Forest Trust, interviewed a number of potential filmmakers. And Imaginary Forces just really stood out. And when we had our first call, and Anthony, I don't know if you remember that, but with Chip and Stephen, not only did their work stand out, but the people stood out. One of the things about life is work is hard. You want to have fun. So these guys was not only were the examples of their work terrific, but they're a lot of fun. So that's how we met, over Zoom.
I appreciate that, Laurie. I've never been called fun before.
Anthony, I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about Imaginary Forces, just a little bit of a background. You guys are a media company, and what types of projects you work on?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, Laurie touched upon it. Like, Imaginary Forces is just a wonderful group of passionate, talented people. They also happen to be very creative. So the studio is comprised of animators, designers, editors, writers, and obviously directors. What makes us a very good fit for a project like this is that we can communicate extremely complex ideas and make them cinematic and entertaining. And just going to the forest, who wouldn't want to go there? It's spiritual whenever you're in the forest almost. So that's why we kind of got involved. And also we like to work on projects that we care about. And so what's more important than the planet? So that's why we really wanted to get involved.
That's great. And Laurie, I wonder if you can explain a little bit more about what Pacific Forest Trust does that's different than other working forests, just to kind of give a better understanding for the listeners.
And this was something that was a lot of fun in working with the film crew and with Anthony, is for many people, a tree is a tree. And you go into an area with trees and you go, this is a forest. But a forest is so much more than trees. So when you manage forests just for trees, you get trees, but you don't get the whole function of the forest. The wildlife, the water, the climate benefits, the diversity. For many people, that is an experience they only have viscerally. So plantation forestry, which is rows and rows and rows and rows of trees, as many as you can get on that acre, those are biological deserts, frankly. Very few creatures live there. As compared to natural forests, which have the greatest biodiversity of any system. And when you look at the global consideration right now, we have 4 million species at risk, going extinct. Most of those are in forests. And you look at the climate crisis, about too much emission of CO2 and not enough natural sequestration, that's from the loss of forests. So managing for forests overall, which is what PFT does, we do harvest for timber, we do get chip, but we're really managing for the whole of the forest, because then you get the trees and the forest both. We're managing for soil health, for the canopy, for the diversity of species, not just one little commodity after another little commodity, which is economically efficient in the short term, but actually quite devastating in the medium and long term.
And what does that mean for forest owners, I guess, in this case? Are they harvesting just part of the forest as opposed to everything that they possibly can? Are they earning money other ways? How else does Pacific Forest Trust manage that forest?
And in answer to the questions, yes, 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 and yes. So we manage every year. In other words, we do timber harvest every year. And this is actually where working with Anthony was so much fun, because I can say all these words and he can show them visually. So in a standard industrial forestry operation, you have these rows and rows and rows of little trees, and you harvest them all. You clear cut, when you go in to harvest at a very young age. That's really cutting off a forest before it's even begun to be a forest. But you take everything off, then you plant little trees again, and you fertilize them, and you pre-commercially thin them, and then you cut them all again, and then you do it again. In the language, that's called mow 'em and grow 'em, or grow 'em and mow 'em. What do we do? And this is what the film shows so well, Anthony, is that when we took over the management of, for example, the Van Eck forests in Oregon, those Douglas fir plantations, instead of just cutting everything and starting over and doing it again, we go in and we do patch cuts or snakes and blobs. We release a lot of the forest to more light and water, but we're leaving the majority of it. So we might take out 30% of the stems. The remaining trees can grow much bigger. They have more light and more water. Then we'll go in and do that again. And doing that on an every 10 or 15 years entry, you more than recover the growth that was there. So we end up with more timber to the acre that we can take out than what you would do on a plantation model, but it does take time to get there. So we earn money through timber, we earn money through chip biomass or fiber, and we also earn money through conservation, through the sale of conservation easements, through the sale of carbon credits in some cases. So we have a much more diverse set of economic returns, in fact. And the conservation value is a very significant financial return, often at half the full value. So you're getting a big slug of cash up front, while you're building up your annual cash returns from harvest. So it's a more diverse, more robust, and more resilient financial model, but it's also more diverse, robust, and resilient ecologically. And that's the difference. You're not just managing for single commodity outputs, which is a pretty risky financial strategy, especially in climate change, because the climate risks from disasters can wipe out your whole crop. But it's where that intersection happens between the ecological return and the economic return.
Yeah, Anthony, I'm kind of curious about your experience in filming this documentary as somebody maybe from the outside, not in forestry yourself. What was it like for you? Did you learn anything that really surprised you about the way they manage the forest?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, as you just heard from Laurie just now, it's almost in modules, and each module, depending on how deep you want to go, can be very complex. So initially, I'm sure Laurie felt this, there was a very steep learning curve for us just to get our heads around the idea and then the smaller ideas within those ideas. And then once we started to get an understanding, is how do we craft a story out of these modules? And, it's a very different way of filmmaking from what we're used to, because ordinarily we can script things, storyboard them. We know exactly where we can have our lighting. We have actors, but we didn't have the luxury of all of that. So we had to go to the forest extremely prepared. One of the biggest shocks of my life was when we did our tech scout, just trying to keep up with Laurie and the foresters. I mean, I've never been so humiliated. I felt incredibly unfit, especially after COVID. But yeah, it was an incredible experience. And I think everyone, not just me, the whole crew found it extremely enriching. And it was a real kind of learning experience for us all.
Did you have to go very far into the forest? Are there trails there, Laurie? Or did you guys have to end up, lugging all your equipment for miles or like that?
Laurie calls them trails. I don't think I would.
Access in is, you have a network of roads that are the haul roads, and then there's skid trails, and then there's trails, and then there's just walking. So depending upon what it was, I think it's fair to say when we went over to see Spanky, so we have a few what are called old growth trees, because this is all land which has been harvested by us and by others for many decades. So there is a very few old growth, which is to say 600, 700, 800-year-old plus trees. So these great big trees, kind of like older people, they're not perfect anymore, right? So the tops may be broken out. You have big branches at the top. On those big branches, plants grow, birds land, other animals live. There's a whole layer of life in the very top of the forests, and you can see little islands of it in these old growth trees. So Spanky, which is one of the trees that Anthony is talking about, is one of those. And to get to Spanky, it is kind of like an all fours, using your knees and your hands to get up the hill, which is why Spanky wasn't cut, because she was difficult to get to. But we wanted to show them what these look like, what these big old trees look like, and some of the features that we're managing for. Because those diversity of features, every time there's a defect from a timber perspective, like a big hole in a tree, that's somebody's home. And actually, usually many people's home. So that's where there is a trail, but it's not like walking in the park. The film crew did not come up. They sent the drone over.
Got it. And what kind of team does it take to manage these forests, Laurie? Do you have a bunch of specialists that help out, kind of depending on the nature of each of the forests?
Yeah, so we have the classic foresters, and people who really focus on the individual tree species and how it grows. But then there's ecologists who are looking again at how the forest interacts, and we work with biologists within that arena. There's wildlife biologists, and then there's fish biologists, and then there's talking with hydrologists. I think it was really fun for Anthony and the crew to meet Steve Sillett and Marie Antoine, who are these folks who've been pioneering understanding the canopy layer and how the tallest trees in the world work. I mean, they're really quite amazing. That's an area where bringing in these different points of view, because forests are such complex systems, and bringing in these different points of view really helps manage for the system. And we kind of, if you will, it's a little bit like medicine. You have a general practitioner or an internist who's for the whole, but you need people who understand the liver and who understand blood and who understand, what regulates the chemical exchanges in the body. And so we, if you will, play the role of the internist or the GP, and then say, okay, this is where we want to bring in a specialist to help, because a lot of what we're doing here is we're building on the internal capacity and resilience of the forest to heal itself. because our forests have been really degraded. They're so much less rich, whether it's from biological diversity or from its carbon stores or from their water functions than they were, but they can come back. And so that's really how we see our job, is working with their innate capacities to restore themselves. And then we bring in specialists to help us when we see that there are issues in these individual areas.
That was actually one of the hardest things for us to get our heads around, is that there needed to be intervention in order to restore the forests. You can't just leave them and they'll restore themselves, because we'd caused so much imbalance as humans to these forests. And so it almost sounds counterintuitive, sometimes taking away trees to help the forest in ways and intervening, planting. It didn't kind of seem right. But now that we've been on this journey with Laurie and PFT, we can understand it and hopefully communicate it to a wider audience.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. I wouldn't have realized that either. If you want a mature forest and that kind of growth, the idea that maybe you need people to intervene seemed counterintuitive initially.
Well, one of the interesting things is we often tend to be kind of, 180 degrees in our points of view. And when people see what's happened to forests, we've looked at forests from a very utilitarian monetary point of view, but not from a utilitarian, gosh, I need air to breathe point of view. And so we managed them for those commodities, and we valued them for those commodities. And then we thought, well, the commodities are all that they're really good for, and that's all that we need. And if we manage for commodities, they'll be there. Not realizing that totally simplifies and degrades forests. The issue, to make it comparable, is particularly as climate change has happened, we've realized that relying on only one kind of potato, the potato blight that wiped out all the potatoes in Ireland, well, we only took 7 of 700 varieties of potatoes from Latin America where they came from. They knew they needed to rotate across the kinds of potatoes that they had to keep the soil rich, to manage for when there was going to be a blight. You needed that diversity to support the crop. And it was part of a plant system, so they integrated with other plants. We didn't realize that with forests. It's just all one tree, because from a commodity point of view, it's so much simpler. We just know that tree, we just know that fiber, the mill spec for that. It's like a little cycle, but that's really depleting the soil, depletes the biodiversity. We also said, well, if you can grow 1 tree to the acre, if we grow 50 trees, that's much better, right? Because it's more of a commodity. The 50 trees take too much water. And as you know, the West has had a lot of drought. They don't survive. The 50 trees being all the same, when you get a pest like the bark beetle, there's no resistance to it. The 50 trees that are all the same, when it's too hot that one day, they all get scorched. It's a very, very short-sighted way of approaching the wealth of the forest. So we look at, well, what do these forest types naturally hold? How many trees would they have on that acre? And if we've got 600 trees to the acre on an acre that ought to have 200 trees, well, you have a lot of trees that you can take out. You don't want to take them all at once because it's too much of a shock. But if you take them out in these, regulated ways, the forest not only regrows, but it regrows stronger, more resilient, and with many more of its features in them. And then you can keep doing that, if you will, ad infinitum. But if you don't get re-involved, if you will, because humans have been involved with these forests for forever, actually, if you don't, then you really open the door, unfortunately, for these highly impactful, catastrophic events. And walking away is walking away from your responsibility to stay involved and engaged and to be good stewards. So that's the kind of 180. It's like, we did terrible things, so don't touch it. Then there's a huge in-between. And that's what we were exploring in this film.
And ultimately, and to maybe bring in a little bit of the finance part of it, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the assumption is you'd like to have big, mature, strong trees that will provide better carbon capture, but also more value for the landowner and for the land?
Well, we end up with more timber harvested to the acre in our 20 years than what the industrial model does, for sure. And that's really a key part of this, is we're looking at consistent long-term appreciation, not boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. I mean, timber markets are volatile in the annual sense, but consistent over 100 years, they appreciate above inflation. They're countercyclical to inflation, and they are a long-term investment. The long-term gets you two things. One is it gets you more stability over time with that consistent growth and appreciation. And two is it gets you a diversity of products that come out of it. So we're not only harvesting big trees, but we're also harvesting small trees. And we do ensure that there is planting in areas where we do small group openings. We will do planting. So there's going to be all these age classes available for harvest over time. So that's really, from a financial perspective, you get a greater return in that long term simply from the timber type of supplies. But in the short term, the conservation return is very high. As we were mentioning earlier in the program, the conservation easements provide a very significant return on capital in the first 3 to 5 years, much more than what timber harvest alone would do, and frankly, more than what carbon credits would do. So the idea is to stack these.
I know the Van Eyck forests are private forests. How important is that in the grand scheme of things here in terms of affecting climate change?
It's an enormous and unknown solution right in front of us. It's really interesting because we know that the loss and the degradation of forests is the second largest source of CO2 emissions in the world. And on the other side, on the flip side, it's the most expandable and safest carbon sink in the world. And so in 20 years, what we've been able to do on the Van Eyck forests is triple and more the carbon while we're harvesting every year. That's the carbon stocks alone. But in the U.S., many people think of, forest loss is really a tropical issue. And it is. The loss of our tropical forests is huge. We need to stop that. What does the United States contribute to this conversation? Well, actually, these forest types are the most productive in the world. The Douglas fir and the redwood forests together, one is 12 times as productive and the other is 10 times as productive. It's really, in other words, these are very powerful carbon sinks. But they're exemplary of the United States forests, which is 60% plus are privately owned. And those forests are generally quite young compared to what they are naturally. And that's one of the key things is here, the older the forest, the more carbon it stores. The more natural that forest is, which is also older, the more resilient it is. What we can do in the United States in 20 years and in 30 years is accrete more carbon again. So in the tropics, you don't want to lose what you have. That'll keep us more or less where we are. It doesn't make it worse. But in the United States, what we can do is make gains. And these forests under climate change have a better chance at stability. So, we can really make a huge difference continuing to harvest, continuing to deliver products, a diversity of products, but transforming what we're doing for climate. And you can feel that difference in the forest. You can see it in the numbers. You can see it in the carbon stocks. You can see it in the biodiversity. It is something where we will solve the climate crisis with a whole series of actions. We have to do it in energy. We have to do it in transportation. We have to do it in manufacturing. We have to be more circular in our economies. We've got to get those plastic-eating bacteria to create new plastic. Got to do those things. None of those things alone makes the difference. Forests are going to be about 40% of the solution. And the United States is a huge part of that solution in the private forests. When you make decisions like were made for the Van Eyck forests, these forests are conserved to be managed as forests forever. One-time decision. We don't have to go to Congress to change the policies every, umpteen years. We don't have to go to court to fight over these things. This is where a private landowner can exercise their private property rights and make these choices and do well financially while we're solving the climate crisis. Because we cannot solve the climate crisis without forests. And it's not just carbon. It's how is our day-to-day weather? What is our water supply? Do we have biodiversity? Those questions of adaptation. How are we going to manage under fire? How do we deal with reducing floods? All of those questions get addressed through forests.
It's amazing to me to learn that over 60% of the forests in the U.S. are private. I guess I just didn't realize that. And have you seen this style of management? Has it been adopted at all in other forests, maybe other forests that you don't manage under PFT, but are people beginning to kind of wake up to this idea?
You're seeing pieces of it that have been picked up. The use of conservation easements is much more common now. The understanding of carbon is much more common now. The Van Eycks were the first on those. The value of this kind of conservation for biodiversity recognized from a regulatory perspective. But the value of this film is really to tell that story. So that's, a lot of this has been keep your head down, do the work, see what the outcome is. And then when you have a good story to tell and get it out there, do so. And that's the value of this film, is it can reach so many more people than, you take people on a forestry tour, you've got like 10 people. Good. You publish a scientific paper, maybe 200 people will see the abstract and 5 will read it. The statistics are pretty depressing for people who work hard on scientific papers. But when you have a good film and a good story, then you can really start to tell that. And that's why we've done this.
And Anthony, what's your hope for the documentary?
First of all, I think that some of the ideas that have just been explained can be a little bit complex. So my hope is that the graphics and the way we tell the story can really communicate these ideas to everyone, so everyone can kind of understand them. And I guess the hope is that I think it'd be great if the film can kind of push legislation or just help scale PFT's efforts and really let people and investors, educators know the good work that they're doing.
So, Laurie, what's next for PFT?
We're celebrating our 30th year and really looking forward to the next 30 years of the organization. And I think that this film is a great way to help us spread the message and how feasible it is and how immediate it is to be able to roll out a solution in climate change at scale. That's really our big focus. And it is also recognizing by transforming the forest industry to really be about forests. Ed, you hear the term TIMOs, Timber Investment Management Organizations. That says it all. Timber Investment Management Organizations. So it's really about forest investment. And so this opportunity to really take the story of how feasible it is, how practical it is, and how impactful it is, that's our next step. And this film is a key part to that.
That's wonderful. What's the best way for people to learn more about Pacific Forest Trust, or I don't know if you have a social media presence and a way to follow you?
We do. We have a Twitter account, an Instagram account, Facebook, and of course our website, www.pacificforest.org. So those are all ways. But we have a very fun Instagram account, which has gotten even more fun thanks to the influence of Anthony and his friends.
And Anthony, how about Imaginary Forces? What's next for you guys, and what's the best way for people to learn more about Imaginary Forces?
We're all over the social channels, so Instagram, you could reach out over LinkedIn. But if you really want to see the rest of our wares and some of our other work, probably a good place is the website. So that would be imaginaryforces.com. But we had so much fun making or crafting this film, and some of the illustrations from the film you may start to see peppered throughout the PFT website. But yeah, what a joy working with PFT.
Well, this is great, and I really look forward to seeing the documentary out there, that people can finally watch it and share it, I hope. I know we'll have a link to it here on the VanEck webpage at vaneck.com. So I invite everybody to watch it. And with that, Laurie, Anthony, thank you so much for sharing your story about the documentary. And let's get people to watch Beyond the Trees.
Thank you. And absolutely.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for tuning in to another episode of Trends with Benefits.